Welcome back. From the observation deck, let's look at something the mind does that most of us never name.
Welcome back to Mindbent. Let's look at something most of us have tried at least once, usually in January or after a particularly energizing podcast, and then quietly stopped, without much of an explanation to anyone, including ourselves. You started cold showers. You had read the studies or heard someone credible swear by them, and you committed. For 8 or 9 mornings, you actually did it. And then on day 9 or 10, you turned the dial and left it warm, and you never quite went back. You remember the specific texture of that moment, the hand on the dial, the mental negotiation that lasted maybe 4 seconds. The compromise that felt reasonable in the moment. You were tired, you had a hard day ahead. You would do it tomorrow. Tomorrow arrived, and you made the same deal. And within a week the whole thing was quietly retired, not cancelled with any drama, just allowed to expire. You called it a lack of discipline. You filed it alongside the water tracker and the 5 a.m. alarm as evidence of something a little disappointing about yourself. That story you told yourself deserves a closer look, because the explanation you landed on, that you are simply not the kind of person who follows through, is not only unkind, it is also factually wrong. I held that story about myself for years. It cost me more than the cold showers ever would have. Let's look at what was actually happening in that 4-second dial moment, because the mechanism is specific. And once you see it, the self-judgment loses most of its grip. Your prefrontal cortex is the region of the brain responsible for what researchers call executive function, planning, self-regulation, the ability to override an impulse in favor of a longer-term goal. It is also, critically, a glucose-dependent system. It burns energy to operate. And here is the part that most willpower literature quietly skips over. By the time you are standing in front of that shower in the morning, your prefrontal cortex is already working at a deficit. Sleep is metabolically expensive. The brain consolidates memory, clears waste through the glymphatic system, regulates hormones, and emerges from the process running lean. The glucose reserves that power your self-regulation are low before you have taken a single step. This is not a character problem. This is a design feature of a brain that evolved to conserve resources. Now add the cold water. Cold exposure is a genuine physiological stressor. When cold water contacts your skin, your sympathetic nervous system, the branch responsible for the fight or flight response, activates immediately. Your body interprets this as threat. Cortisol and adrenaline rise. Blood is redirected. Your breathing changes. The research on cold exposure is genuinely interesting, and the benefits are real, but those benefits arrive after your nervous system has processed the experience as a threat and survived it. In the moment of contact, your body is not doing a wellness ritual, it is handling an emergency. What you were asking yourself to do every morning was this: with a depleted prefrontal cortex, override a sympathetic nervous system threat response, using willpower alone, with no environmental cue, no anchor, no structure, except a vague rule you made one evening when you felt motivated. That is not a discipline problem. That is a blowtorch trying to light a candle every single morning from scratch. The concept from Japanese philosophy that maps most cleanly onto what was missing is Lai, sometimes translated as ritual, but more precisely understood as structured form that makes right action effortless. Li is not motivation. It is not willpower. It is the design of the environment and the sequence of action so that the correct next step requires less deliberation than the incorrect one. A martial arts bow before sparring is Li. Setting chopsticks in a specific direction is Lai. The ritual is not the point, the ritual removes the decision. This is exactly what the basal ganglia, the brain's habit formation system, is built to do. Once a behavior is chunked into a reliable sequence, the basal ganglia can execute it with minimal prefrontal involvement. The glucose cost drops dramatically. The threat override becomes easier because the nervous system has learned to anticipate what follows the cue. Hebbian plasticity, the principle that neurons that fire together wire together, means that a consistent sequence of environmental cues followed by the same action literally changes the physical structure of the neural pathway over time. The cold shower becomes less an act of will and more a grooved response to a specific sequence of events. But that wiring only happens if the sequence is consistent and if the early reps are low enough in friction that the prefrontal cortex doesn't veto them before the basal ganglia can learn. This is where the 30-day challenge model fails almost everyone. It sets a behavioral target, cold shower every morning, without designing the sequence that makes that target reachable from a depleted glucose state. It asks the blowtorch to light the candle every day, and when the blowtorch eventually runs out of fuel, it calls you the problem. So, let's talk about what actually works. Not a new challenge, a sequence. The first thing to understand is that your nervous system is not afraid of cold. It is afraid of the unknown. The threat response activates partly because the cold is sudden and uncontrolled. A practical modification backed by the research on graded exposure is to start the shower warm and reduce the temperature in the final 60 seconds only. This is not a compromise. This is a physiological ramp that allows the sympathetic response to begin from a lower baseline. The norepinephrine release, the primary benefit being studied in cold exposure research, still occurs. But you are not asking your depleted morning brain to jump into a threat state from a standing start. The second thing is the environmental anchor. Tonight, before you sleep, place your towel on the floor directly in front of the shower. That is all. Not a note, not a phone reminder. A physical object in the path of the behavior. In the language of LI, that towel is the ritual form. When you see it tomorrow morning, your basal ganglia has a cue. The decision is already half made before your prefrontal cortex has fully come online. The third thing is the 2-minute rule applied specifically to the cold portion. Commit to 10 seconds of cold water, not 60. Not 2 minutes, 10 seconds. Count them aloud if it helps. The counting activates the prefrontal cortex gently, gives it a task it can complete, and the completion triggers a small dopamine prediction reward signal that makes the sequence more likely to repeat tomorrow. 10 seconds is below the threshold where the threat response can build into a veto. It is also enough to produce measurable physiological benefit and, more importantly, enough to tell your nervous system, this sequence is survivable. It ends. I come back from it. The fourth thing is language. Stop using the word discipline to describe what you are trying to build. Substitute the word sequence. Discipline implies a moral quality you either have or lack. Sequence implies a design problem you can solve. When you stood at the dial on day 9, you did not lack discipline. You had an unsupported sequence meeting a depleted system at the worst possible moment. That is an engineering problem, not a character verdict. You are allowed to have tried this and stopped. You are allowed to have called yourself undisciplined and been wrong. You are allowed to start the sequence tonight with nothing more than a towel on the bathroom floor and a willingness to count to 10 tomorrow morning. Your nervous system is not your adversary. It is a system that runs on structure, and for 8 or 9 mornings you gave it something real. The fact That the structure collapsed does not erase those mornings. It tells you what the structure was missing. Your past exhaustion in front of that dial was not failure. It was a signal that you were using the wrong tool. Raw willpower, solo, unreinforced, at the worst metabolic moment of the day. The right tool is simpler. Tonight, put the towel down. Tomorrow, step onto it. Turn the shower on warm, wash. In the last minute, turn the dial toward cold and count to 10 out loud. That is the whole sequence. Do that for 5 days without judging the temperature, without measuring the result, without calling it a challenge. Just notice that you did it. If this helped you see your own morning negotiation a little more clearly, I invite you to click the next video and subscribe. We are here to keep observing without judgment and with total clarity. I'll see you in the next one. If you have stood at that dial and made the warm deal with yourself, tell me which day it was. I read every reply and I'm genuinely curious where the sequence broke down for you.
Take a deep breath. Feel the ground beneath you. Whatever you noticed in yourself today is welcome here.